Now, Sax was born in Belgium. Both his mother and his father were instrument designers. But Sax was really a musician. He studied at the Brussels Conservatoire, and he had this combined set of gifts. He was a musician, and he had the inherited interest in the design of instruments. In 1842, he moved to Paris, which was the center both of musical education through the Paris Conservatoire, of musical creativity because of the institutions that were there. And there were a mass of instrument makers. And he befriended people like Hector Berlioz, the great composer. He also made a lot of enemies, but I'll come to that in a moment. His most important inventions were families of instruments. One known as the sax horns, and if you look at that at the bottom of those two illustrations, just below the drums, you will see a whole row of instruments that are basically the same shapes but different sizes. And that's the great thing about what Sax did. It's the same with probably his most famous instrument, the saxophone, which is at the top there. They were families of instruments which could play together in a homogeneous sort of sound. The great thing about him was he was a phenomenal musician. He conducted the stage band in the Palace Opera, but the bad side of him was that he was a very good musician, but he was a terrible businessman. He died in Paris in 1894, completely impoverished by a number of disputes and legal cases which came because people sued him because they thought they'd nicked somebody else's designs, or he was suing somebody else. Can we have the next slide, please? His great achievement was that he perfected existing valve designs. He was possessed with the idea of sound. He wasn't the person who invented the valves, but he perfected them. He also designed entirely new instruments like the saxophones and the saxophones. He also devised ways of manufacturing them in large quantities. If he'd have been a better businessman, he would have been tremendously rich, but he wasn't. But he did actually, in a sort of micro way, develop the idea of mass production. Now, this wasn't truly mass production because these people you can see in the picture were properly craftspeople, but he did produce them in size, in quantity. His ideas were used by other manufacturers throughout the world, either legally or illegally. He completely revolutionized military bands. Military bands were immensely important in France in the 19th century because they were a representation of the Republic. And he revolutionized military band instrumentation throughout the world. And a family of brass performers called the Distins got the British franchise to manufacture his instruments in Britain, and they initially called the bands to which they were sold saxhorn bands, but they soon became known as brass bands. So that is what originated the entire brass band movement. The next slide, please. Final one. And this is the final slide. I mean, some of his ideas seem odd today, but they were all absolutely brilliant. This instrument, you probably don't know what it's called, but it's got a very simple name to Sax. He called it the trombone. This was his invention of the trombone. It was a valve trombone. It was brilliantly designed. It was probably the best playing instrument that valve trombone made in the 19th century, but it was very difficult to get on a luggage rack, and nobody ever invented the case into which it could fit. But everything he did musically was absolutely brilliant. He made individual instruments as well as his family instruments, and we're going to see some of those now. So that's as much as I have to say. Thanks for listening.